After the storm, a ranger was inspecting a remote area of the park when he found something that wasn't on any map. A massive rock with a narrow passage. Just a few steps inside, and it became clear that this place had been hidden for a very long time. What he discovered there, and why the truth turned out to be dangerous, read until the end. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The storm had passed, but the park no longer looked like the place it had been just 2 days earlier. What had once been a carefully balanced wilderness now felt raw, unsettled, as if the land itself had been torn open and left exposed. Entire sections of forest lay flattened, massive trees ripped from the soil and thrown aside like broken tools. Their roots stood upright, tangled and slick with mud, forming grotesque walls of earth and stone. Trails that had existed for decades were gone, erased under landslides and debris, their familiar curves replaced by jagged scars cut into the slopes. Streams had swollen into brown, violent ribbons, carving new channels through the terrain and leaving behind fields of silt and shattered branches. The ranger moved through this altered landscape with cautious, measured steps. Every sound mattered now, the crack of a branch settling under its own weight, the distant slide of loose rock, the faint rush of water somewhere below. He had worked in this park long enough to understand what storms like this could do, and even longer to know that the danger did not end when the sky cleared. In the days after such destruction, the land remained unstable, unpredictable, capable of shifting again without warning. His assignment that morning had been straightforward on paper: a post-storm inspection of the northern sector, a remote area rarely visited by tourists even in good weather. It was rugged, steep, and difficult to access, which was why it had been deprioritized during routine patrols. Now, however, it was precisely the kind of place that demanded attention. Landslides could expose hazards, wash out old barriers, or open paths that should never be accessible. The responsibility fell to him to assess the damage and determine whether the area needed to be closed off entirely. He was alone, not by choice, but by necessity. The storm had stretched the park's resources thin. Roads were blocked, communication lines damaged, and several teams were already deployed in more populated zones where the risk to visitors was higher. He knew this terrain better than most, and that familiarity had made him the obvious choice to check this sector. Still, as he moved deeper into the forest, he was acutely aware that familiarity no longer guaranteed safety. The old trail was barely recognizable. In some places, it vanished entirely, swallowed by mud and fallen timber. He relied on memory, compass readings, and subtle signs etched into the landscape. A distinctive bend in the slope, a cluster of boulders half buried in moss, the way the ground dipped before rising again toward the ridge. Several times he stopped to examine the earth, noting fresh disturbances that had not been caused by the storm alone. A snapped branch here, a shallow footprint pressed into damp soil there. They were not numerous, but they were recent. It was unsettling. This section of the park had been officially closed during the storm and was not scheduled for inspection until his patrol. If someone else had passed through, they had done so quietly and without authorization. He made a mental note of it, but pressed on. After a storm like this, people sometimes ignored warnings, drawn by curiosity or the misguided belief that danger had already passed. As he climbed higher, the forest began to thin, replaced by exposed rock faces and steep inclines where the soil had simply slid away. The storm had peeled back layers of earth, revealing stone that had likely not seen daylight in centuries. That was when he noticed the slope ahead looked wrong. Not merely damaged, but altered in a way that did not align with the natural patterns he knew so well. A section of hillside had collapsed inward, spilling dirt and debris down toward the ravine below. At the center of this collapse stood a massive stone formation, newly revealed. It was not a scattered cluster of rocks or a fallen slab, but a single imposing mass of stone embedded deep into the ground. Wide, tall, and immovable, it dominated the space around it. The storm had stripped away the soil that once concealed its base, exposing contours that immediately drew his attention. He approached slowly, studying the surface. The stone bore the marks of age, its face weathered and uneven, but something about it felt deliberate. A vertical fracture ran down its center, narrow at the top and widening as it reached the ground. At first glance, it might have been mistaken for a natural crack, the result of freezing and thawing over countless seasons. But the closer he came, the less convincing that explanation became. At the base of the fracture, the opening was wide enough for a person to pass through, not comfortably, but without having to squeeze. The edges were worn smooth in places, not in the random way water erodes stone, but with the subtle regularity of repeated contact. The ground in front of the opening was uneven, yet certain stones had been arranged as if to create a stable approach. He knelt, running a gloved hand along the rock, feeling the faint ridges that hinted at human effort. He checked his navigation equipment and maps, first digital, then the physical copy he carried as backup. There was no record of any structure or notable formation here. No marked cave, no geological feature of significance, nothing that would justify such a prominent stone mass being left undocumented. The park surveys were thorough, even obscure formations were logged, studied, and referenced. This was not something that could have been overlooked by accident. His unease grew as he examined the area around the opening. Branches lay stacked nearby, their placement too intentional to be the result of a storm. Several rocks had been moved and wedged together in a way that suggested they had once served as a crude barrier. Beneath a thin layer of mud, he found rusted metal fragments, bent nails, and a length of wire partially embedded in the soil. These were not remnants of a fallen sign or trail marker. They belonged to something else entirely. He straightened, scanning the forest behind him. The trees stood silent, their trunks dark with moisture, their canopies dripping steadily. The air felt heavy, carrying the sharp scent of wet earth and broken pine. Nothing moved. No voices, no distant machinery, no indication that anyone else was nearby. Yet the evidence before him made it clear that this place had been concealed deliberately, not abandoned to chance. For a moment he considered the protocol. He could mark the location, retreat, and report the finding, requesting a full team and proper equipment. That would be the safest course. But the storm had already changed the landscape. Whatever lay beyond that opening was now exposed, vulnerable to further damage or discovery. If someone had been using this place recently, they might return. If evidence existed inside, it could be lost. He documented the site carefully, taking photographs, recording coordinates, and noting the condition of the surroundings. Then he stood at the threshold of the opening, listening. A faint current of air flowed outward, cool and steady, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of stone and something older, deeper. It was the breath of a space that extended far beyond the reach of daylight. The ranger adjusted his gear, secured his light, and marked the entrance so he could find it again if necessary. He told himself that he would only take a brief look, just enough to understand what he was dealing with. One step inside, no more. But even as he crossed into the shadow of the stone, he knew that whatever lay beyond that fracture was not something he could simply glance at and leave behind. The forest behind him remained silent as the light faded, and the stone swallowed him whole. The moment the ranger crossed the threshold, the world behind him seemed to recede unnaturally fast. Daylight thinned into a pale stripe clinging to the edges of the stone fracture, and within a few steps it was reduced to a dull glow that no longer offered direction or comfort. The air changed immediately. The damp scent of forest soil gave way to something drier and heavier, layered with dust, cold stone, and a faint metallic undertone that lingered in the back of the throat. Every breath felt louder, more deliberate, as if the space itself demanded attention. He paused just inside, allowing his eyes to adjust while his hand reached for the flashlight clipped to his vest. When he switched it on, the beam cut a narrow tunnel through the darkness, revealing walls far too regular to be the result of natural erosion alone. The stone surfaces bore shallow grooves, linear and repeated, running at angles that suggested human tools rather than the slow violence of water or ice. The floor beneath his boots was uneven but purposeful, sloping gently inward instead of dropping abruptly as a natural fissure might. He took another step, then another, careful to place his weight evenly. Loose gravel shifted underfoot, producing a muted scrape that echoed faintly ahead. The sound did not dissipate quickly. Instead, it returned to him softened, reshaped by distance, confirming what his instincts had already begun to suspect. This passage extended much farther than the opening suggested. The walls narrowed slightly, then widened again, guiding him forward with a subtle certainty. He ran the light along the stone, noting places where the surface had been chipped back, as if widened deliberately to accommodate shoulders or carried loads. In several spots, the stone bore darker stains, long faded but distinct enough to imply repeated contact. This was not the work of a single desperate act, nor of curious hikers carving their names. It was functional, methodical. As he advanced, the floor beneath him changed texture. What had begun as raw rock gradually transitioned into a series of shallow steps, their edges worn smooth. They were uneven in height and width, lacking the precision of modern construction, yet their rhythm was unmistakable. Someone had carved them to be climbed again and again. Dust had settled into the depressions, disturbed in places by footprints of varying age. Some were barely visible, softened by time. Others were sharp, recent enough that their outlines had not yet been claimed by the fine powder coating the stone. He stopped and crouched, angling the light downward. The newer prints were not his. They angled inward, deeper into the passage. A faint unease crept in, not yet fear but a sharpened awareness that he was no longer tracing history alone. He marked the wall discreetly, a habit ingrained through years of backcountry work, ensuring he could retrace his path if needed. The steps continued downward, curving gently to the left. With each turn, the sense of separation from the surface grew stronger. The sound of wind and dripping water from the forest above vanished entirely, replaced by a thick, pressing silence, broken only by the scrape of his boots and the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. His light revealed small details that deepened his concern. Rusted metal embedded in cracks along the wall. Old bolts driven deep and long since abandoned. Shallow holes at regular intervals, as if something had once been mounted there and later removed. The ranger straightened and moved on, his pace deliberate but unhurried. Panic would serve no purpose here. Observation mattered more. He began to notice patterns, the way the passage narrowed at certain points, forcing anyone entering to slow down, the way the ceiling dipped low in places, requiring a slight bend at the waist, the way the steps angled subtly, channeling movement forward rather than allowing easy retreat. It felt designed, not maliciously, but with intent. At one point, the beam of his flashlight caught on something unexpected, a faint line running along the wall at shoulder height, barely visible until the light struck it just right. He stepped closer. The line was a stain, darkened stone smoothed by repeated contact, as if countless hands had brushed against the same spot. Nearby, he noticed a series of shallow scratches, not random, but grouped, marking distances or counts. They were crude but purposeful. The passage bent sharply, and when he rounded the corner, the last trace of daylight disappeared entirely. He was alone now with the artificial circle of light he carried, its reach limited, its edges swallowed by shadow. The air grew cooler, more still. He detected a subtle change in smell again, something faintly acrid mixed with the mineral scent of stone. It reminded him of old machinery, long unused but not forgotten. He tested the next few steps carefully. They were solid, carved deep into the bedrock. This was no temporary excavation. The effort required to create this path would have been significant, demanding time, labor, and secrecy. He wondered who would have the motivation to undertake such work here, in the heart of protected land, far from roads or settlements. As he descended further, the space ahead began to open. The echo of his movements shifted, growing broader, suggesting a larger chamber beyond the narrowing corridor. Before reaching it, he spotted something else that made him stop short. Along the right-hand wall, partially obscured by mineral deposits, were remnants of old fixtures, hooks bent and rusted, short lengths of wire still clinging to the stone, marks on the ceiling where something had once been suspended. Lighting, he realized. Crude, improvised, but effective. This place had not relied solely on darkness. Someone had ensured it could be used repeatedly, safely enough for extended stays. The implication settled heavily in his chest. He advanced to the edge of the widening space, keeping to the side, minimizing his silhouette. The beam of his flashlight swept across the floor ahead, and the ground dropped away into a broader, flatter surface. The ceiling rose, allowing the sound of his movement to disperse. His light caught the dull gleam of metal, the curved outline of something cylindrical, the corner of what might have been a crate. He did not step fully into the chamber yet. Instead, he stood at the threshold, listening. The silence was deep, layered, the kind that belonged to places long removed from the surface world. No voices, no movement, no immediate sign of life. And yet everything he had seen so far spoke of use, not abandonment. The storm had revealed the entrance, but it had not created what lay beneath. Whatever this place was, it had existed long before the hillside collapsed. It had been hidden deliberately, carved patiently, and maintained just enough to remain functional. The ranger drew a slow breath and stepped forward, knowing that what he was about to see would determine whether this was merely an anomaly to be reported or something far more serious, something that could not be sealed back into the earth and forgotten. The light widened, the space opened fully before him, and the descent ended where a different kind of discovery was waiting. The beam of the flashlight swept slowly across the widened chamber, and with every movement of light, the space revealed itself not as a natural cavity, but as something shaped, occupied, and abandoned with intention. The floor was uneven, yet largely flat, its surface scarred by scratches and darkened patches, where something heavy had been dragged repeatedly. The ceiling rose higher than the corridor behind him, arching irregularly, but offering enough clearance for a man to stand upright without stooping. The echo of his steps softened here, spreading outward instead of snapping back, confirming the chamber's size. The first objects to emerge from the darkness were metal, dull, rusted, unmistakable. Cylindrical barrels lay on their sides near the far wall, some collapsed inward, others still intact but streaked with corrosion. Their surfaces bore no modern labels, no warnings, only the faint impressions of markings long eaten away by moisture and time. Nearby, a cluster of tools leaned against the stone, as if left there deliberately rather than discarded. Shovels with warped blades, a pickaxe with a splintered handle, a crowbar bent slightly at the tip. These were not relics of a single effort, nor the scattered remains of trespassers passing through. They had been gathered, used, and set aside. The ranger stepped fully into the chamber, careful to avoid disturbing anything unnecessarily. His training asserted itself now, overriding the initial shock. This was no longer just an exploration. This was a site that demanded caution, documentation, and restraint. He moved slowly, letting the light linger on each detail, building a mental map of the space. Along one side of the chamber, the stone wall had been smoothed artificially, flattened to create shallow recesses. In those recesses, remnants of storage remained. Wooden crates reduced to frames by rot, their planks warped and darkened. Fragments of plastic containers, newer than the wood, cracked but recognizable. He knelt to examine one, noting how the plastic had not yet become brittle enough to suggest the extreme age. It was old but not ancient. Decades at most. The arrangement of the space struck him as methodical. Items were grouped by function rather than scattered randomly. Tools in one area, containers in another. An open patch of floor near the center showed signs of repeated use. Scuffed stone, ash embedded in the cracks, a darkened ring where heat had once licked upward. He could almost picture the small, controlled fire that had burned there, contained and watched carefully to prevent smoke from betraying the chamber's existence. Near that darkened patch, he found the remains of what had once been makeshift bedding. Boards laid side by side, now warped and partially collapsed, with strips of fabric and insulation material tangled among them. The fabric had long since lost its color, but its presence spoke of human comfort, however crude. Someone had slept here, not for a night or two, but repeatedly. As he continued his slow circuit of the chamber, another unsettling pattern emerged. The condition of the objects varied sharply. Some tools were deeply rusted, their surfaces flaking at the slightest touch of light. Others showed only surface corrosion, their edges still defined. The same contrast appeared in the containers. Metal barrels beside relatively intact plastic jugs. Old rope, stiff and frayed, coiled near newer cordage that retained flexibility. This was not the remains of a single era. The site had been used, abandoned, and used again. The realization tightened something in his chest. The storm had exposed the entrance, but the activity here had not ended with the passage of time. It had simply gone unnoticed. He approached one of the barrels and angled the flashlight inside. It was empty now, but residue clung to the bottom, hardened and dark. He could not identify it immediately, but it was not natural sediment. Nearby, the floor bore long streaks where liquid had once spilled and been wiped away repeatedly, leaving faint overlapping traces. This had been a working space, not merely a hiding spot. In a narrow section toward the back of the chamber, the stone wall recessed further, forming a shallow alcove. Here, the signs of organization were even clearer. Items had been arranged deliberately, stacked or lined up, some placed on flat stones to keep them off the damp ground. He noticed fragments of packaging, torn labels, and handwritten markings that had faded to near illegibility. Dates, perhaps. Codes. He could not tell yet, but they were not random. The ranger paused, letting the silence settle around him. It was complete, unbroken by any sound other than the quiet hum of his own presence. Yet the space felt heavy with the suggestion of past movement. He imagined the chamber lit by dim lamps, shadows shifting as people moved deliberately through the same paths he now followed. He wondered how many had stood where he stood, and for what purpose. He resumed his inspection, turning his attention to the floor. The dust layer was uneven, disturbed in places where footprints overlapped. Some impressions were old, softened into vague shapes. Others were crisp enough that the tread pattern was still visible. He followed one set carefully, noting its direction. It led from the corridor into the chamber, then toward the alcove, then back again. Repeated movement, back and forth, as if someone had worked here recently and left in a hurry. That thought made him straighten slowly. He swept the flashlight around again, more alert now, more aware of his vulnerability. The chamber offered no immediate exits beyond the corridor he had used to enter. If someone else were nearby, deeper within the rock, he would have little warning. He listened, straining for any sound that did not belong to him. There was nothing. Still, the knowledge lingered. This place was not a relic sealed in time. It had breathed, changed, adapted. Near the alcove, he discovered something else that sharpened his focus even further. A small container, wedged behind a loose slab of stone. It was not immediately obvious, positioned low and partially concealed. He eased the slab aside just enough to peer behind it, careful not to disturb its placement more than necessary. The container was metal, rectangular, its surface scratched and dented. It had been opened before, closed again, and hidden deliberately. He did not open it yet. Instead, he noted its presence and location, resisting the urge to satisfy his curiosity prematurely. Whatever lay inside would be important, but so would the context in which it was found. Rushing could cost him information he did not yet know he needed. The deeper he looked, the more the chamber revealed its purpose as something beyond a simple shelter. The arrangement of space, the careful concealment, the blend of old and new materials all pointed towards sustained, organized use. Not by hikers seeking refuge from the elements, but by people who expected to return, who planned for longevity and secrecy. As he completed his circuit, the weight of the discovery settled fully on him. This was not an anomaly. It was not an isolated curiosity. It was evidence of a hidden presence within the park, one that had operated outside the boundaries of what was known, recorded, or officially acknowledged. He stood near the center of the chamber, the flashlight illuminating the rough stone floor, and considered his next move. He could turn back now, seal the entrance as best he could, and report the existence of an illegal site. But the signs he had seen suggested something far more serious than unauthorized use of protected land. The organization implied here hinted at purpose, at intent that went beyond hiding from view. As if in response to his thoughts, his light caught on something small near the far wall. He moved closer and knelt, his breath slowing as he examined it. It was personal, not a tool, not a container, but an object that belonged to an individual rather than a group. Something worn, carried, and kept close. The storm had revealed the entrance. The descent had confirmed human design. And now, standing in the heart of the forgotten camp, the ranger began to understand that the true nature of this place would not be defined by what had been built here, but by who had passed through it and why. He lifted the object carefully, the implications already forming in his mind, and knew that from this point forward there would be no turning back. The object he had noticed near the far wall lay half buried in dust, as if it had been deliberately placed and then forgotten in a moment of haste. When he lifted it carefully, brushing away the fine powder that coated its surface, he felt an immediate shift in the weight of what he was doing. It was a wristwatch. Not expensive, but solid, practical, the kind worn by someone who valued reliability over appearance. The glass was scratched, the strap cracked with age, yet it was intact enough to suggest it had not been lost to the elements. It had been taken off and left behind. He held it in the light for a long moment, turning it slowly. On the back, barely visible beneath grime, was an engraving, initials and a date, the kind of personalization people add to mark ownership, not expecting it to ever leave their wrist. The ranger felt a tightening in his chest as he realized this was no anonymous scrap. This had belonged to someone specific. He returned the watch gently to the ground, marking its position mentally before moving on. His attention sharpened now, no longer scanning the chamber as a whole, but searching deliberately for similar signs. They appeared quickly, once he knew what to look for. Near the alcove, partially concealed behind a broken crate, lay a folded map. It was a park-issued trail map, its edges frayed, corners softened by repeated handling. Several routes were marked in pencil, some circled, others crossed out. One section of the park, the very sector he had just traversed, was heavily annotated. A few steps away, he found a pair of sunglasses with one arm snapped off. Further along the wall, tucked into a crack in the stone, was a wallet. Empty now, its contents long gone, but still carrying the shape of cards that had once filled it. He did not need to open it to know what it represented. These were not items dropped carelessly by hikers. They were collected, gathered, and stored here. As he continued his slow, methodical search, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Personal belongings appeared in clusters, arranged with unsettling order. A backpack stripped of its useful contents, but still holding a child's keychain clipped to the zipper. A jacket folded neatly, its fabric worn thin at the elbows. A set of keys without a ring, metal dulled from handling. Each object spoke of an individual, of a life interrupted. The ranger's thoughts drifted involuntarily to the cases he remembered from his years in the park. Missing hikers, lone campers who never returned, seasonal workers who vanished between shifts. Many had been written off as accidents, as people who strayed too far or underestimated the terrain. Others had simply faded into rumor, their names mentioned briefly and then forgotten as years passed without answers. Standing here now, surrounded by their possessions, those explanations felt hollow. He raised the flashlight to the walls, and that was when he noticed the markings. They were faint at first, easy to miss amid the scars left by tools and time. But once seen, they multiplied. Dates scratched into the stone. Short vertical lines grouped in uneven clusters. Simple symbols repeated at irregular intervals. None of it was decorative. It was communication, left behind by different hands, each mark cut with urgency. Some dates were isolated, others layered over one another, as if multiple people had used the same spot to record time. The spacing suggested days, perhaps weeks. In one area, the stone bore a series of deep gouges clustered together, far more aggressive than the rest. He traced them with his light and saw faint discoloration around the edges, darker than the surrounding rock. Whether from rust, dirt, or something else, he could not tell, but the implication was disturbing. The architecture of the chamber took on new meaning as he studied it through this lens. The narrowness of the entrance, the controlled descent, the lack of alternate exits. This was not merely a hidden shelter. It was a place designed to be difficult to escape once entered. The chamber itself offered space, but the corridors leading to it acted as funnels, guiding movement in one direction while restricting it in the other. He examined the floor more closely and found additional evidence. Scuff marks concentrated near one section of wall, where the stone was smoother and worn down. The wear pattern suggested prolonged contact, as if people had been forced to sit or lie there repeatedly. Nearby, he spotted small metal rings embedded into the rock, nearly invisible beneath layers of mineral deposits. They were old but not ancient. They had been installed, not formed. The ranger straightened slowly, his breathing steady but his mind racing. This was no accident. This place had been used to hold people. Temporarily or otherwise, he could not yet say, but the signs were unmistakable. The belongings, the markings, the physical layout all pointed toward the same conclusion. People had been brought here against their will. A sudden thought struck him, chilling in its simplicity. If this place had been active for years, perhaps decades, then some of the disappearances he remembered might not have been isolated tragedies. They could have been connected, part of a pattern that had gone unnoticed or ignored. He turned back toward the corridor, scanning the shadows beyond the chamber. The silence pressed in on him, heavier now, charged with implication. He became acutely aware of how vulnerable he was, alone in an enclosed space that had once trapped others. He listened carefully, attuned to any sound that might indicate movement deeper within the rock. There was nothing, but the absence of sound did little to ease his unease. He moved again, this time toward a smaller recess he had not yet examined. Inside, he found a pile of items that made his stomach tighten. Pieces of clothing layered together, some adult-sized, others smaller. The fabrics were different, the styles varied, suggesting different owners and different times. This was not a single incident. It was repeated behavior. Among the clothing, he found a laminated card, its edges cracked. It was a temporary work permit issued by the park, the photo worn but still recognizable. The name printed beneath it was one he remembered seeing on an old bulletin board years ago, listed among seasonal staff who had left without notice. At the time, it had been dismissed as someone moving on without paperwork. Now holding the card, that explanation felt dangerously inadequate. The implications expanded outward, touching every assumption he had made about the park and the people who ran it. Access to work permits, knowledge of patrol schedules, familiarity with remote terrain. Whoever had used this place had not been an outsider fumbling through unfamiliar land. They had known exactly where to build, how to hide, and when to act. A faint disturbance in the dust near the edge of the chamber caught his eye. He crouched, examining it closely. A footprint, not old enough to be fully softened, not sharp enough to be brand new. It overlapped older marks but was distinct, its tread pattern clear. It was not his. The realization sent a cold wave through him. This place might not be abandoned at all. Someone could have been here recently, perhaps even after the storm, checking on what the landslide had revealed. The idea that he might not be alone beneath the stone shifted his priorities instantly. He moved toward the entrance of the chamber, angling his body to keep his light trained ahead while glancing back periodically. He reached for his radio, raising it instinctively, only to remember the dead zone he had noticed earlier. Still, he tried. Static answered him, broken and useless. He took a breath, steadying himself. Panic would only make mistakes more likely. He needed to secure what he could, preserve evidence, and get out safely. As he turned back one last time to survey the chamber, his light caught on something else, partially hidden behind a collapsed crate. Papers, not random scraps, but organized, folded, and stacked. He approached them carefully. The top page bore handwritten notes, numbers arranged in columns, and names abbreviated in ways that felt intentional. There were references to locations, dates, and what appeared to be quantities. More importantly, some of the notations matched internal designations used within the park's infrastructure system. The meaning was unmistakable. This place was not merely connected to missing people, it was connected to the park itself. The ranger gathered what he could without disturbing the scene beyond necessity, photographing each item and committing details to memory. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on him. What he had found could not be handled quietly or internally. It reached too far, implicated too much. As he turned toward the corridor to leave, the thought echoed in his mind with unsettling clarity. The storm had not created this horror. It had only stripped away the cover that allowed it to exist unseen. And now that it had been exposed, the question was no longer whether the truth would come out, but how much resistance it would face along the way. Leaving the chamber felt harder than entering it. The ranger moved back through the corridor with a heightened awareness of every sound and shadow, his flashlight no longer a tool of curiosity, but of vigilance. The knowledge of what lay behind him pressed forward with each step, reshaping the meaning of the narrow passage and the worn stone beneath his boots. This place was no longer an unknown anomaly hidden beneath the forest. It was evidence, fragile and exposed, and now that he had seen it, it demanded action. As he climbed the carved steps, he became acutely aware of the marks he had noticed earlier. The scuffed stone, the hand-worn sections of wall, the faint stains that suggested countless passages. They no longer felt abstract. They were proof of repetition, of a system that had functioned quietly, protected by distance and indifference. He resisted the urge to rush, forcing himself to maintain a steady pace, knowing that haste could erase details he might later need. When he emerged from the stone fracture into daylight, the forest greeted him with deceptive calm. The air was cool, the leaves heavy with moisture, the light filtered softly through the broken canopy. It looked like the same park he had patrolled for years, and yet it felt irrevocably altered. He took several steps away from the entrance, scanning the surrounding area for signs of movement. There were none, but the unease did not fade. He marked the location again, more discreetly this time, choosing natural features rather than obvious indicators. Then he moved to higher ground where he might catch a signal. His radio crackled faintly as he adjusted the angle, and after several attempts, a weak connection finally pushed through the static. He transmitted the coordinates and reported the discovery in careful measured terms. He described an unrecorded underground structure, evidence of prolonged human activity, in the presence of personal belongings that suggested possible criminal relevance. He did not yet share the full extent of what he had found, not because he doubted its importance, but because he understood how information traveled and how easily it could be redirected or softened before reaching the right ears. The response was delayed and oddly restrained. He was told to secure the area if possible and await further instructions. The phrasing struck him as deliberately vague. No urgency, no immediate escalation, just a suggestion to monitor and document. It was not the reaction he would have expected if the discovery were treated as potentially serious. As he made his way back toward the ranger station, his thoughts began to organize themselves into patterns, just as the evidence underground had done. He replayed the contents of the chamber in his mind, overlaying them with his memories of the park's history. Seasonal workers who had vanished without formal resignation, contractors whose assignments were poorly documented, maintenance crews that rotated through remote sectors with minimal oversight. At the time, none of it had seemed extraordinary. Now those gaps looked deliberate. Once inside the station, he accessed the internal archives. The storm had disrupted power earlier in the week, but the systems were back online, and the familiar glow of screens felt strangely reassuring. He began with the simplest comparison: dates. He pulled reports of missing persons associated with the park and aligned them with maintenance logs, trail repair schedules, and contractor access permits. Patterns emerged slowly at first, then with unsettling clarity. Several disappearances coincided with periods of increased activity in the northern sector. Not tourist surges, but work assignments, slope stabilization, trail reinforcement, drainage improvements. Projects that justified the movement of heavy tools, barrels, and supplies into secluded areas. Projects that would explain the sound of digging, the presence of equipment, and the temporary alteration of terrain. He drilled deeper into the records, noting inconsistencies that had once seemed trivial, incomplete signatures, missing timestamps, authorizations that referenced internal codes rather than standard descriptions. Some entries appeared to have been duplicated or modified after the fact. It was not the chaos of poor administration. It was the careful smoothing of rough edges. The deeper he went, the more uncomfortable the picture became. Access to such projects was limited. Only certain roles had the authority to approve them, and only certain personnel knew the patrol schedules well enough to avoid detection. This was not the work of outsiders exploiting the park's isolation. It was something that had grown from within, fed by familiarity and opportunity. As the afternoon wore on, he felt the subtle shift in atmosphere around him. Conversations in the station quieted when he entered a room. Glances lingered a moment too long. A supervisor asked him to summarize his findings again, this time focusing on safety concerns rather than the contents of the site. The emphasis was clear: frame it as a geological hazard, not a criminal one. The suggestion unsettled him more than open resistance would have. He responded professionally, reiterating the facts without embellishment. But he made a point of documenting every exchange. Dates, times, phrasing. He saved copies of his notes and images in locations beyond the standard system, ensuring that they would not disappear quietly if access was restricted. Later, as evening approached, he returned to his desk and reviewed older incident reports. Some dating back decades. He recognized names. Some belonged to people who had long since retired. Others belonged to individuals still employed by the park in administrative or support roles. The realization that this history spanned generations made his chest tighten. If this had been allowed to persist for so long, it meant that silence had been rewarded and questions had been discouraged. The first direct pressure came subtly, a message advising him to take a day off, to rest after the storm, a reminder about protocol and chain of command. Nothing overt, nothing threatening, just enough to suggest that continuing on his current path would complicate matters. He understood the implication immediately. If he handed everything over internally and stepped back, the narrative could be shaped without him. The entrance could be sealed, the site labeled unstable, the belongings cataloged and quietly removed. The missing would remain missing, their stories absorbed into the park's long list of unresolved incidents. That possibility hardened his resolve. He began assembling a parallel record, organizing his findings chronologically and thematically. He cross-referenced photographs with maps, matched handwritten notes from the chamber with internal codes, and highlighted the overlaps between personnel access and reported disappearances. The story that emerged was incomplete but coherent enough to demand independent scrutiny. He also became more cautious. He varied his routines, kept his materials with him, and avoided discussing the details of his findings openly. Trust, once assumed, now felt fragile. He could not be certain who might be invested in keeping the truth buried, or how far they might go to ensure it remained that way. Late that night, he reviewed one final document, a maintenance authorization from years earlier that referenced a stabilization effort near the very slope where the storm had revealed the stone fracture. The language was vague, the approval unusually swift. The signatures belonged to individuals who had long since moved on, promoted or transferred. It was not proof, but it was a thread. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the day settling over him. The discovery in the forest had been only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, not in the darkness beneath the stone, but in the offices and systems that preferred order over truth. He knew then that if he waited for permission to act, nothing would change. The trail he had uncovered did not lead deeper into the wilderness. It led inward, toward the very institution tasked with protecting the land and the people within it. And following that trail would come at a cost. The question was no longer whether the truth existed. It was whether he was willing to endure what would happen once he insisted on bringing it into the open. The following morning brought an efficiency that felt rehearsed rather than responsive. Before the ranger had even finished reviewing the notes he had compiled overnight, word arrived that a team would be dispatched to the northern sector. Not an investigative unit, not specialists trained to preserve evidence, but a mixed group drawn from maintenance, safety oversight, and administrative supervision. The justification was delivered in the language of procedure: post-storm hazards, unstable rock formations, risk to staff, and potential trespassers. The phrasing was careful, sanitized, and conspicuously absent of any reference to what he had actually found underground. By the time he reached the staging area near the damaged road, vehicles were already lined up. Equipment had been unloaded with practiced speed. Temporary barriers were being assembled, and warning signs lay stacked nearby, all bearing the same generic message about geological danger and restricted access. The efficiency unsettled him. In his years at the park, even routine safety operations moved slowly, tangled in approvals and delays. This was different. Someone had wanted this site controlled immediately. He joined the group without comment, observing rather than confronting. As they moved toward the forest sector, he watched how certain individuals navigated the terrain with ease, taking routes that avoided unstable ground without hesitation. They knew where to step. One man in particular walked ahead confidently, rarely checking his footing, as if the landscape held no surprises for him. The ranger noted it carefully. When they reached the exposed slope, the reaction was telling. There was no visible shock, no moment of discovery. No one asked where the entrance was. Instead, instructions were issued calmly, directing equipment toward the base of the stone formation. A safety officer spoke at length about the risk of collapse, about liability and prevention. The underground passage was referred to as a fissure, a fracture, a naturally occurring hazard that needed to be secured before someone was hurt. The ranger felt a tightening in his chest as the narrative took shape around him. This was not an investigation. It was a containment operation. He watched as two workers approached the opening, peering inside briefly before stepping back. Their expressions were neutral, almost bored. One of them nodded and said something quietly to the supervisor, who responded with a curt acknowledgement. There was no discussion of documenting the interior, no mention of the objects inside, no concern for preserving what the storm had revealed. The focus was singular: closure. When the ranger spoke up, his voice was steady, professional. He reminded them that the interior showed signs of prolonged human activity and that the site warranted proper documentation before any alteration. The response was polite but dismissive. He was told that his observations would be included in the report, but that immediate stabilization took precedence. Safety first. Always safety. The phrase rang hollow. Safety had never moved this fast. As preparations continued, he noticed another detail that confirmed his growing suspicion. Several individuals avoided looking directly at the opening. They kept their attention on equipment, on paperwork, on anything but the dark fracture in the stone. Others, however, glanced inside with a familiarity that bordered on recognition. Their eyes lingered for just a moment too long, as if checking on something they expected to see. He stepped back, positioning himself where he could observe without interfering. His hands were steady, but his thoughts moved quickly. If they sealed the entrance now, access to the chamber would be lost. Whatever evidence remained inside would be inaccessible. Its significance reduced to his word against an official report that framed the site as a natural hazard. The belongings of the missing would disappear behind layers of concrete and debris, their stories entombed with them. The pressure increased subtly as the morning wore on. A supervisor pulled him aside, speaking in low, measured tones. There was concern about his well-being, about the stress of the storm, about the possibility that he had misinterpreted what he saw in the dark. The implication was clear. Doubt yourself and let this go. He listened without reacting, his expression neutral. Inside, his resolve hardened. He recognized the tactic. It was easier to question a single individual's judgment than to confront the implications of systemic failure. Easier to frame this as overreach than to acknowledge that something deeply wrong had been allowed to exist. He returned to his vehicle under the pretense of retrieving additional documentation. In reality, he was safeguarding what he already had. He transferred files, duplicated photographs, and secured copies of coordinates and timestamps on devices not connected to the park's internal systems. He ensured that the evidence could not be erased with a single administrative decision. By midday, the operation at the site intensified. Heavy equipment was brought closer. The sound of machinery echoed through the forest, jarring against the quiet that had defined the area since the storm. The ranger stood at a distance, watching as barriers went up and the official story solidified. A landslide hazard, an unstable rock formation, a preventative closure. What struck him most was not the act itself, but the coordination behind it. Decisions were made quickly, approvals granted without hesitation. This was not the slow, grinding machinery of bureaucracy. It was the response of a system accustomed to protecting itself. The moment that crystallized everything came when he saw one of the workers discreetly remove a small item from near the entrance and pass it to a supervisor who pocketed it without comment. The ranger could not see what it was, but the gesture was unmistakable. Something had been taken, something that was not meant to be cataloged. He understood then that time was no longer on his side. Attempts to formally object were met with deflection. He was reminded of his role, his responsibilities, his obligations to the chain of command. He was told that further involvement would not be necessary, that his part in the discovery had been acknowledged, and that others would handle the rest. It was a polite dismissal, wrapped in procedural language. He was being sidelined. The personal cost of resistance became clearer as the afternoon faded. A message arrived notifying him that he would be placed on temporary administrative leave, pending review of his conduct during the inspection. The wording was neutral, almost sympathetic, a precaution, standard procedure. But the intent was unmistakable. Remove him from the equation while the narrative was finalized. He sat in his vehicle for a long time after reading it, watching the controlled chaos of the operation from a distance. The forest beyond remained unchanged, indifferent to the human struggle unfolding at its edge. The stone formation stood silent as equipment moved around it, its dark opening still visible, but already diminished by scaffolding and warning tape. Anger flared briefly, then settled into something colder and more focused. This was not about him anymore. It was about what would happen if he allowed this to end here. If he accepted reassignment, accepted the official explanation, accepted that the missing would remain unresolved because the truth was inconvenient. He knew then that the only way forward lay beyond the park's internal mechanisms. Any attempt to pursue this quietly, through proper channels, would be absorbed and neutralized. The system had already demonstrated its priorities. That evening, he reached out through a channel he had deliberately kept separate, an external oversight body with jurisdiction beyond the park's administrative reach. He did not dramatize his account. He presented facts, evidence, timelines, and inconsistencies. He shared copies of documents, images, and logs, emphasizing the urgency created by the ongoing closure operation. When he finished, he sat back and exhaled slowly. There was no turning back now. By involving an outside authority, he had crossed an invisible line. The consequences would follow, professionally and personally. As darkness settled over the forest, machinery finally fell silent. The site stood barricaded, its future uncertain. The ranger remained in his vehicle, watching the last workers depart. He knew that the attempt to bury the truth had not ended. It had only begun, but so had the resistance to it. The response did not come immediately. For 2 days after, he sent the materials outside the park's chain of command. Nothing happened that he could see. The barriers remained in place around the stone formation. Official notices were posted. Internal communications circulated carefully worded statements about temporary closures and ongoing safety assessments. From the outside, the situation appeared settled, controlled, resolved. For the ranger, those days stretched painfully long. Administrative leave confined him to the margins of the place he had spent most of his adult life protecting. His access to systems was restricted, his badge temporarily inactive, his presence tolerated, but no longer welcome. Colleagues who had once greeted him with easy familiarity now avoided prolonged conversation. Some offered quiet nods of support when they thought no one was watching. Others looked at him with open resentment, as if he had betrayed something sacred. He spent the time reviewing his own records again and again, ensuring that nothing had been overlooked. Photographs of the chamber, timestamps, notes taken in careful detail. He replayed each decision he had made since stepping into the stone fracture, testing them against doubt. The conclusion never changed. If he had stayed silent, if he had allowed the official narrative to take hold, the truth would have been sealed away as thoroughly as the entrance beneath the rock. On the third morning, the first sign of change arrived quietly. 2 unfamiliar vehicles appeared at the edge of the park, bearing no park insignia. Their presence drew immediate attention, and the atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Conversation stopped when they passed. The ranger watched from a distance as credentials were presented, verified, and escorted inside administrative offices. External oversight had arrived. The investigation unfolded methodically, with none of the haste that had characterized the attempt to close the site. Requests were made for access to records, logs, and personnel files. The stone formation was reclassified, its closure status revised pending further review. When access to the underground passage was requested, resistance surfaced immediately, framed once again in the language of safety and liability. This time, it did not hold. The ranger was called in to provide a formal statement. Sitting across from investigators who had no stake in the park's reputation, he laid out everything he knew. He described the storm, the exposed slope, the unmarked stone formation. He detailed the descent, the carved steps, the forgotten camp, and the personal belongings left behind. He spoke without embellishment, relying on evidence rather than accusation. The investigators listened closely, asking precise questions, noting inconsistencies between his account and the official reports that had already been filed. When access to the chamber was finally granted under external supervision, the truth became impossible to ignore. The attempt to seal the entrance had been incomplete, rushed. Enough remained visible to corroborate his claims. The chamber was documented thoroughly this time. Every object photographed, every marking recorded. The personal belongings were cataloged carefully, treated not as debris but as evidence. The process that followed was slow and painful. Old cases were reopened. Names once dismissed as footnotes resurfaced in official files. Families were contacted cautiously at first, then with increasing certainty. Some identifications were made quickly, based on distinctive items and records. Others required time, forensic analysis, and patience. With each confirmation, the weight of what had been hidden grew heavier. Inside the park administration, fractures appeared. Decisions made years earlier were scrutinized under new light. Maintenance authorizations, contractor access, and unexplained discrepancies were traced and retraced. Patterns that had once blended into bureaucratic noise now stood out starkly. It became clear that while not everyone involved had known the full extent of what was happening, enough people had known enough to allow it to continue. Responsibility spread outward rather than concentrating neatly. Some individuals were removed from their positions immediately. Others were placed under investigation. A few attempted to deflect blame, claiming ignorance or procedural error. The records told a different story. Silence, it turned out, had been documented just as thoroughly as action. For the ranger, the consequences were deeply personal. He was cleared of wrongdoing, his actions deemed appropriate given the circumstances. His administrative leave ended, but the return was not triumphant. The park he came back to was changed, stripped of illusions. Trust had been damaged, perhaps permanently. The quiet pride he once felt wearing the uniform was now tempered by the knowledge of how easily systems could fail those they were meant to protect. There were moments when the cost weighed heavily on him. He lost professional relationships that would never be repaired. Advancement opportunities quietly vanished. He became known as the one who had forced the reckoning, a reputation that carried respect in some quarters and resentment in others. It would have been easier, he knew, to look away. Yet there were other moments that steadied him. Letters arrived from families who had spent years without answers. They did not thank him for solving everything, because not everything could be solved. They thanked him for refusing to let the silence continue, for acknowledging that what had happened mattered. The stone formation remained closed, its future undecided. It was no longer hidden, no longer denied, but it was not open to the public either. Some places, it was decided, should not become attractions. They should remain reminders. The forest slowly reclaimed the disturbed ground around it, moss creeping back over exposed soil, fallen branches settling into new patterns. Nature moved forward, indifferent to the human need for closure. On quiet patrols months later, the ranger sometimes passed near the ridge where the storm had changed everything. The scar on the hillside was less pronounced now, softened by time and growth. From a distance, nothing about the landscape suggested what lay beneath. Only those who knew the story understood its significance. He often thought about the storm, about how violence and chance had done what years of routine never had. It had stripped away the cover, exposed what was buried, and forced a choice that could no longer be postponed. The truth had not emerged because someone wanted it to. It had emerged because the land itself had been torn open. In the end, the ranger understood that the most dangerous thing he had uncovered was not the chamber beneath the stone. It was the ease with which everyone had learned to live alongside unanswered questions. The passage in the rock had been hidden deliberately, but the silence that surrounded it had been maintained by comfort, fear, and convenience. Standing at the edge of the forest one evening, watching the light fade through the trees, he accepted that some consequences could never be undone. But he also knew that the choice he had made mattered. The missing were no longer just stories whispered among old staff. They had names again. They had places in the record. They had been acknowledged. The storm had passed, the ground had shifted, and something buried for decades had finally been brought into the open. That, he believed, was worth everything it had cost him.